Hey everybody, this is Simon from ShowMeThatAgain.com. In this video we're going to have a look at getting started in 3D Coat version 4. So when you first start the program you can see it in the background and you've got this dialog box with a bunch of getting started options. There's a whole lot of really interesting things here, but in this video we're just going to do a bit of voxel sculpting and a bit of surface mode. So let's get started by clicking on voxel sculpting. And once you've done that, you get another dialog coming up saying, hey, what sample shape do you want to start with? And I'm just going to choose a big sphere here like that. Now 3D Coat is a very big program with a lot of stuff that you can do in it. In order to make this more manageable, what they've done is split the functionality in 3D Coat into different workspaces called rooms. So we have this row of tabs along the bottom of the toolbar here for switching between rooms. Because we chose voxels from the dialog box at the start, it's put us in the voxels room by default. So I've loaded up this model of mine, it's called a Saber Mech, to show you the different features of the different rooms. Now the voxel room is where we block out the rough form of our models, then refine their shape, and of course add all sorts of fantastic details using the very powerful tools in 3D Coat. Once we've got our high poly sculpted model how we want it, we shoot over to the retopo room. So retopo is short for retopologization, and that's just a fancy word that basically means painting a low poly mesh over a high poly one. We do this because while a model with 1,000,000 polygons might be fine in 3D Coat, it's not going to come anywhere near being able to run in, or even import into, a real-time game engine. So we make a low poly version of our model and use a bunch of technical wizardry to make it simulate the appearance of our high poly model. This is also where we create what are called the UV seams for our model. UV seams are an important part of a process called UV mapping. Basically what happens with UV mapping is that we split our model into parts and then flatten them out so that we can fit a 2D texture to them. And the UV seams are how we say where we want our low poly model to be split in this process. So over here you can see these green lines are telling 3D Coat where I want my low poly mesh to be split. Now the parts that we split our 3D mesh into are called UV islands. Once we've done all this, we're ready to do what's called a merge. That's where we project all of the detail from our high poly mesh into special textures that we then place onto the surface of our low poly model to simulate the appearance of the high poly one. You can think of it as being sort of like one of those old style holograms that you can look at from different directions, and it has the appearance of being 3D even though it's just a flat surface. Now over here in the UV room we've got a bunch of tools for tweaking the layout of our UV islands. It's worth noting that your model will only show up here after you've done a merge in the retopo room. Over here in the paint room we've got a bunch of different painterly type tools for painting on the surface of our low poly model. At the moment you're seeing the overlap between my high poly model and my low poly model. I'll just shoot over the Vox tree here and hide the high poly model, and you can see the low poly one underneath. And then last but not least, we have the tweak room, which is where we can make last minute mesh modifications or perhaps adjust the pose of our model and create morph shapes and so on and so on. Now one of the first things that I like to know about when I'm learning a new 3D program is how to move around in the 3D viewport. Now by default in 3D Coat, if you want to navigate around in your viewport, the first thing that you have to do is make sure that your cursor is not over your model. Then once you're over empty space, you can left click and drag to orbit, middle click and drag to pan, right click and drag to zoom. Now I actually find it a bit of a pain having to move your cursor off your model every time you want to navigate. So fortunately, if you hold down the Alt key on your keyboard, you don't have to. Now you can just left, middle or right click and drag wherever you like, either over your model or not, and it'll navigate your viewport for you. Now our model is very dark looking at the moment. It's got this very pitch black shadow on the bottom of it here. So let's select what's called a different shader from our shaders panel to change the way that our model looks. Now there's a whole bunch that you can try here. If you click on them you get all sorts of different cool looking things happening. So go through and try a few different ones of those. But the one that I really like, if I just mouse wheel down further in the panel, is this clay one. It's a good one that lets us just see nice even lighting, but with a little bit of a shadow so that when we're doing sculpting, we can see exactly what we're doing very clearly. Now let's have a look at some of the basics of sculpting on the surface of models in 3D Coat. If I hover my mouse cursor over my model, I'll see this yellow circle with a red line through it. This is called the brush. Now I can left click and drag on my model to draw on it with the currently selected tool. In this case, it's Grow. I can right click and drag on my model. If I right click and drag left or right, that will adjust the size of my brush. If I right click and drag up and down, that'll increase the strength of my brush. There we go. If I hold down Control on my keyboard, that will invert my brush and make it paint in the opposite direction. If I hold down the Shift key, that'll switch over to smooth mode. And now when I left click and drag, that'll smooth out anything that I've put onto the surface of my mesh. Now if I press W, that'll toggle between shaded mode and wireframe mode. Now at this distance, with the current density of the mesh, wireframe doesn't look too different from shaded, but if I zoom in a bit closer, you'll see the underlying mesh that 3D Coat has generated automatically to represent the voxel sculpting that we've done. I can press W to toggle back, of course. Now some of the time, the stuff we want to sculpt can be quite symmetrical, which is just a fancy way of saying one side is the same as the other side. Now rather than doing one side of a model and then having to go over to the other side and do the exact same stuff all over again, we can turn on symmetry mode in 3D Coat and have it do it for us automatically. So if you press the S key on your keyboard, it'll open up this little symmetry menu pop-up. Let's choose symmetry across X axes. Now you can see this red plane which indicates where the center of the symmetry will be. And if you draw on one side of the symmetry plane, you'll see whatever you do on that side show up automatically on the other side. As you can imagine, this can be a huge time saver, so it's a pretty good feature to know about. I can toggle symmetry off again if I need by going back to the symmetry menu and choosing no symmetry. There we go. Righto, let's have a look at the viewport menu in the top right corner of the viewport. A bunch of buttons along here. The first three buttons have to do with lighting. So this one here is to adjust the ambient lighting. This one here is to adjust the brightness. This one here is to adjust the direction. Like that. Now if you're really observant, you'd have noticed how adjusting some of these didn't really make any difference to the way the model looked. That's because all of these shaders down here in the shader panel are what are called real-time shaders, written in a language called HLSL. So what that means is that these shaders don't just specify what color a surface is going to be and how reflective it is, etc., etc. They also specify how the surface responds to light and shadow. Now some shaders are programmed to go and find out what the lights in a scene are doing and respond accordingly, while other shaders are like, you know what, I'm just going to make up my own lighting. So for instance, this clay shader that we're using here currently doesn't really care what we set the direction of the light in the scene to or the ambient light setting, but it does listen to the primary light intensity and use that to determine how bright it should be. There we go. But if I come over to the bronze no cavity shader at the top of the panel, click on that guy for instance, now when I adjust the direction of the primary light, you can see this particular shader is listening to that and responding to it. I'm going to go back to the clay shader though because I like that one. Now the next three items up here are all for navigation. So we pretty much don't need them because our Alt mouse shortcuts work so well. This button up here adjusts the field of view, which has this effect. You can create either stretched out views or fisheye views. I don't really like it or use it, so I'll just put that back to 50. The next three buttons relate to your camera view. So if I click on the All button, that'll frame my camera up so that I can see everything in my scene. The next button is the Pan button, It zooms onto where your brush is on the surface of your mesh, which is a bit silly because it's not on the mesh, it's up here on the button. Fortunately, there are keyboard shortcuts for this. If I go Shift A, that will do all. If I go Shift Z while hovering my mouse cursor, that'll zoom in on that part. But to be honest, I don't really use these functions very often because, again, the mouse shortcuts with the Alt key are so good and fast for moving around that you just don't really need to. Unless, I suppose, if you had a really big scene, they might be handy. But we don't. And the no circle is really just to reset the camera to the default position that it was at when you first created the scene. Now the next button along is the Perspective Orthographic View toggle. It's the one that looks like a little cube. This guy's pretty important. It's the one that lets you switch between a 3D view like this, where things get smaller as they get further away, and a 2D view, where they don't. Now all your mouse navigation works in orthographic mode too, but for me personally, I don't like looking at my model from an angle in orthographic mode. I pretty much only use it for looking at my model from what I call the plan views, i.e. front, left, top, etc. Now on that note, there's a handy little keyboard shortcut for snapping to these views. So if you're Alt left mouse button and dragging to orbit, while you're orbiting, if you just tap the Shift key on your keyboard, it'll snap to the nearest plan view. So I'm in the left viewport at the moment. If I Alt left click and drag around this way a bunch and then hit Shift, it snaps to the front view. I could Alt left mouse click over to the top and hit Shift, and it'll snap to the top view, and so on and so on. So I'll go back to perspective. Now there is a keyboard shortcut for toggling between perspective and orthographic. It's the 5 key on your number pad. That's the set of numbers over on the right hand side if you've got a big keyboard. It's not the 5 in the row of numbers along the top of your keyboard. So if I press 5 on the number pad, that'll toggle between orthographic and perspective. You might just need to check if it's not working for you. You might need to check that you've got the num lock on. It's a key on your keyboard that you can use to toggle your number pad between being used for numbers or being used as cursor keys. The next part of 3D Coat that we need to learn about is called the Vox tree. So if you come over to the Vox tree panel here, now the Vox tree allows you to create different layers for different objects so that you can work on them independently from each other. The root layer doesn't contain any sculpting. Basically, it represents the entire 3D scene. And any stuff that we want to put in that scene has to get put in its own layer. So for instance, when we chose the sphere from the dialog box at the start, 3D Coat made this new layer here called Volume 9 for it to go in. Now there's a couple of controls here on the left hand end of every layer. Let's have a look at what they do. First of all, you've got the Show Hide button, which does pretty much what you'd expect. Then you've got the Ghost button, which makes the contents of the layer see-through and unselectable. And then very importantly, you've got the Voxel Surface Mode button, which allows you to toggle between voxel-based sculpting and surface-based sculpting. So when I click it, it turns to an S. And notice that I also get a slightly different selection of tools now. I can click it again to go back to voxel mode. So the big benefit of sculpting with voxels is that we can just sculpt whatever we want, wherever we want, and we never have to worry about stretching or tearing the mesh. This is because the changes we make in voxel mode aren't saved directly into the 3D mesh of our model. Instead, they're saved separately as lots of very little cubes, sort of like Minecraft, but with a much higher resolution. And then after every change we make, 3D Coat custom makes a brand new mesh to fit over the surface of those cubes. I'll zoom in here and go to wireframe mode, and if I just sculpt a little bit, you can see how 3D Coat is adjusting the mesh on the fly to fit whatever shape I've sculpted. The downside to voxel sculpting is that this dynamic mesh has a uniform density. That means that if we have a big simple model and we want to add a bit of fine detail just down in one corner of it, we have to increase the resolution of the entire model, even in the areas where we don't really need to, which is not very efficient. The big benefit of sculpting in surface mode is that when we need to, we can add more detail in some areas without having to add it in others. And even better, some of the tools we can use in surface mode will add in extra topology for us automatically. So if I go and switch over to surface mode, I've got a tool down here selected called Live Clay. When I paint with it, you can see how it's adding in extra topology to the mesh. Now the downside of surface mode is that you have to manually keep an eye on where this extra detail has been added. If you don't, you can end up with too much detail where you don't need it, which will affect 3D Coat's performance, or not enough detail where you do need it, which will result in low quality surfaces. Also notice that if you've been in surface mode and you've added some dynamic detail, if you go to switch back to voxel mode, it'll ask you what resolution you want to go back into voxel mode with. So I'll go OK. You can see now how it's sort of kept the shape but not the resolution. So if I undo that and want to have more of this fine detail in here, I'd actually have to manually increase this here. So currently it's about 300,000. If I say, what about 500,000? Go OK. Because the uniform density of the voxel surface is now higher resolution, it's been able to keep some of that fine detail down there underneath. Now, if you've switched back from surface mode, you might notice sometimes that the tool options from the surface tool stay open. Just click on your voxel tool to make it go away. Now, if you hover over the solid part of the layer, you'll see this little button on the left hand end of it called Downgrade the Volume. This can be handy if you're working on a really high poly model that's getting a bit sluggish and you need to make some large changes to it. Downgrade will create a temporary low poly proxy which you can manipulate and tweak. So let's click on this, see what that looks like. It thinks for a second. Now it creates this lower poly version of our mesh. Notice that the density is not uniform. So if you look over here at your layer, it's switched automatically to surface mode in order to be able to do this. Now that I'm in this low poly version of my mesh, I can make some changes. And if I switch back by coming back to that same button, I'll notice now that it's now called Restore. So when I click on that, it'll restore back to my high poly mesh and apply those changes that I made in the downgraded volume. And I'm still in surface mode. If I want to, I can now switch back to voxel mode. Another thing to know about these layers in the Vox tree is that if you right click on them, there's a very long menu of things that you can do to them here. In this video though, we just want to cover basic operations to get you grounded in 3D Coat, so we're not going to try and dig through all of those options just yet. Now down here at the bottom of the Vox tree panel, we have a row of menu buttons for doing various things. This guy here will create a new layer, and this guy here will delete it. This one here will make a duplicate of the current layer. I'll undo that. This guy here will edit the settings of the shader. In this case, we have the clay shader on the model. If we click on this button, we'll see the options that are available there. I'll just cancel that. The next button along here is for creating a space with identical density and transformation. We'll skip over that because we're just looking at basic operations in this video. This one here will copy stuff from one side of your model to the other. This one here is a biggie to know about. It's the button that will allow us to increase the resolution of the current object. So if I click on this, for example, and I'm in voxel mode here, it's saying, well, this operation can't be undone. Do you want to continue? It's going to take 150 meg. Now, that's actually not a lot. So we'll go, yeah, sure. Okay, and now you can see that the wireframe density of the mesh has increased significantly. Down here in the layer, we can see 2 times in square brackets. Now, a little tip, when you're in wireframe mode, it's a lot slower. So now that we're increasing the resolution, we should press W to go back to shaded mode. You'll find that we can navigate and draw still nice and quickly, in spite of the higher resolution. Now, this second to last guy here is called the Clone and Decrease Level of Details Twice button. It's just a shortcut for making a lower resolution version of your volume on a new layer. I'll undo that because I don't want to do that at the moment. And then the last button here is just for emptying out your layer. I don't want to do that either, so I'll undo that. Now the last thing that we're going to have a look at in this first video are some of the basic options that are available when we're working with tools from the toolbar over here. Now I'm in voxel sculpting mode at the moment, and I think I'll use the airbrush tool to demonstrate. So generally, with the tool palette on the left, if I come up to this big T up here, I can click on it to see different visual representations of the tool sets. I'm going to go back to the default one though, because I quite like that. If you want to minimize it, you can click on that little arrow there, and then this one here to maximize it again. While you're in the tool palette, if you roll your mouse wheel, that'll allow you to go up and down like that. Or if you're in the actual viewport, you can press space and it'll bring up a quick access menu like this. If you just mouse away from it, it'll go away. The other thing that's useful about the toolbar is that if you hover over the tools, most of them have pretty useful tooltips that pop up. Some don't. Now if you look up here in your main toolbar, there's a bunch of basic options up here that are quite good to know about that work with whatever tool that you've got selected. First of all, you've actually got a thumbnail and the name of the currently selected tool. That's quite good because this palette over here on the side is quite long. You can be all mouse wheeled away over here and thinking, oh wait, what tool do I have selected again? You just look up here. The next option is the invert tool action. This is basically the same as holding down Control when you draw. So I normally just hold down Control when I draw. The next one along is actually very handy. This is called steady stroke. Now, just for a way of explaining it, watch what happens when I try to draw a circle just using my mouse. It's a bit wonky, right? If I come around a bit more to some empty space and turn on steady stroke, just using the default settings, watch what happens when I draw over at my brush. If I left click and drag, so now we've got this green line trailing behind. Just that very act of trailing along behind actually helps me draw a lot smoother. Notice the difference there. Now, steady stroke's fantastic. Sometimes it can be the best thing ever. Other times it can sort of get in the way. So I'm just going to turn it off for now quickly. Now after steady stroke, there are a couple of little buttons here. This first one is called Edit Curves. It basically lets you turn on pressure sensitivity for a tablet so that when you push harder on your pen, it'll affect the brush size over here in the viewport. The next one along is the lock brush size. So by default, if I zoom in and out, my brush size gets smaller or bigger. But if you lock it, your brush size will stay fixed, regardless of how far you zoom in or out. Some people prefer to work that way. I don't, so I'll turn it off. The next option in the toolbar is the radius. This is actually the size of the brush, so you'll notice if I right click and drag left and right to change my brush size in the viewport, that this number is also changing up here. I could click in here and type in an exact number if I wanted to, or I could also drag left and right on the name to set it there like that. But I prefer to set the brush size in the viewport like that. The next setting along is the fall off. This basically says soften off the effect of the brush as it gets nearer to the yellow circle on the edge of the brush. Over along here we have our depth setting, which is currently set to 0. Let me just bring that back up a bit. There we go. There are a few options here that basically, again like previously, allow the tablet to control this time the depth, and also a lock option here that allows your pen radius and your depth to be related. I just like to stay with the default option. And then over here is your smoothing amount. That's the one that comes up when you hold down Shift with your brush over your model. So if I left click and drag now, it's smooth. And the amount of smoothing, when I right click and drag up and down, is that value over there in the main toolbar. Now we've really only just scratched the surface as far as looking at what's possible in 3D Coat. And there's certainly a bunch more things to go through, but I think that's a good place to pull up for this first video. We've gone over a bunch of basic concepts and operations and found our feet a bit so that we can feel like we know what's going on in the different parts of the interface while we're working in 3D Coat. In the next couple of videos, we'll dig in a bit deeper and start looking at some workflows that we can use to create more sophisticated models.